Hi, I'm Chad Lawson. This is the Internet Radio Project, and you're watching Verbose Mode. Hi, I'm Chad Lawson. This is Verbose Mode, the show dedicated to learning to learn and the freedom to fail. Today we are going to start a multiple episode series on my internet radio project. This has been the biggest project that I have dealt with to date. It's still not completed, so I'm hoping that over the course of the next few episodes, as we talk about it, this will actually finally get finished. It's been on my bench on and off for the better part of 3 years now. It started off with one very specific scope, one very specific intention, and it has changed and grown and failed. So it's been multiple different learning points, multiple different breakdowns, and we're going to take and break this project down into its smaller parts, and each episode will focus on one of the smaller individual parts of this project, and we'll then put it all together as a whole. Now, I want to talk about how this project began. As you've heard me mention on the podcast before, I am a member of Milwaukee's Makerspace. If you're not familiar with a Makerspace, think about why somebody owns a gym membership. The idea is that you can go and use the various resources, the weights, the machines, racquetball, what have you, but also have access to some learning resources from the coaches and trainers that are there. And all of this without having to own this equipment in your own house. Makerspace is pretty much the same thing, but with instead of free weights and treadmills, you have laser cutters, 3D printers, drill presses, CNC mills, a lot of different tools of creation, sewing machines and acrylic cutters, just lots and lots of various tools. At Milwaukee Makerspace, we are what is considered to be a community-driven makerspace. The decisions, while we have a board that makes a lot of the big picture decisions, everything that is done from cleanup to installing of new equipment is done by the various members. Some of the tools are owned by the members. The training is done by the members. It is a member-driven makerspace. But one of the neater things that we have there is called the hack rack. And it used to be one individual rack. It has since grown into multiple racks. And it's a lot of discarded equipment, some of which probably still has a lot of good life in it. But it's put out there as free to anyone who can give it a good home under the idea of, if you can hack it, you can have it. Now, this isn't the first time that I've taken anything from the hack rack. When I'm in Big Brothers Big Sisters, and when my little brother and I started going to the Makerspace for various projects, early on there was a remote controlled car, a very dead car. It was missing a couple of wheels. The shell was very cracked and not at all staying on the chassis anymore. But I went ahead and picked it up, and we used it as an opportunity to pick apart how it worked and see what could potentially be used for this for a robotics framework, and beginning from there. So fast forward some time, till about 3 years ago, I happened to be at the hack rack and saw this beautiful vintage tube radio. As you can tell, I love all things vintage, that yesterday's tomorrow scheme. So when I saw this even in its state it was at the time, I immediately fell in love, and I had plans for it. At the time, I thought it was covered in rust. Turns out, this is plastic. It doesn't rust. So that made me very happy. That meant it wasn't going to immediately fall apart. So I started cleaning up. It was till somebody pointed out to me that since it's not rust, what was it that was growing on it? That creeped me out a little bit, but I try not to think about that. So I spent a lot of time cleaning it up, took off the various knobs. Now, opening this up provided me some different ideas, but I loved the dial, this nice little metal brass plate, the back plate, and I'm going to go to the close-up camera. The back plate was just simply attached with these 3 screws, and it was hovering. It was attached to the frame here, so it was just kind of floating in its space. So after removing that, I was able to see that this backplate also has on it the antenna. This is just brilliant, that this is just a very fine wire wrapped around to create that antenna, the very long antenna, and then has its terminal blocks and was attached to the rest of the frame. Now, I probably could have removed the entire chassis, leaving this on, but I didn't know at the time, so I started by removing that. And then once I could see inside, I noticed that pretty much everything was held into place by through the front. Those knobs on the front were what was keeping me from being able to remove it. Once I got the knobs off and started to remove the chassis, I also, as part of the cleanup process, had removed this little front decoration, as well as this plate that has all the different numbers on it. Now, without that in place, you can see the little red line here that indicated as you change the channel. And this thing is very rusted on the internal frame, so I can't really turn it to show you. But taking this after that, this entire thing just simply slides out. So when I started messing with this entire project, one of my initial goals was to be able to see how much of the original pieces I could use. As I mentioned, I love that whole the vintage feel of it. Unfortunately, the radio wasn't working, while many of the tubes themselves appear intact, and I've already promised them to another member of the Makerspace. But there was also the speakers, by the way, attached. Let me go back up front. The other speaker was pretty well blown. There was a large crack through the cone, so there wasn't going to be anything I could do with it. So also, the trick to these speakers is they are much higher resistance than most of the speakers you can play with these days as a hobbyist. So even if I had continued to use these speakers, I was going to have to push the radio a lot harder to get the same level of sound I could use with a much more lower resistance speaker now. And like I said, the other one was cracked, so it wasn't going to do me a lot of good. This entire frame was designed to work around a much higher voltage, whereas this is, 110, 120 volts, whereas most of the hobby electronics we play with these days are in the 3.3 and 5 volt range. So this was going to, anything I used from here was designed around a much higher voltage system than I'm used to dealing with for what I was going to be doing. So I ended up having to get rid of the entire chassis. Or the entire, so that left me with the body, the back plate, getting rid of the speakers. The tubes, though, are a nice little fun story. Going back to talking about my little brother, we were at the Makerspace, probably a couple years ago now, and working on a kit that is a discrete 555 chip. And I have some upcoming projects and some upcoming episodes really diving into the 555 chip. It's a timing circuit that has just become this. It's pretty much universal in the maker world for electronics. So this kit was a larger version of it. It was probably, if you've seen the 555 chip, it's very small. This kit was about this big, and it showed each of the individual transistors and resistors inside the 555 and inside their individual little blocks, so you could see how the actual circuit worked. So I was showing it to Elijah as he was putting it together, and I grabbed a 555 and showed him this small little chip and showed him that everything he was building from these transistors and resistors that he'd seen in other kits we'd put together was then shrunk down to being this tiny little chip. And that blew his mind and opened his eyes. He was excited about that. And I went to my locker where I still had the internal pieces of this radio, and I grabbed one of the tubes and I explained to him that its purpose within this radio was effectively to be a transistor. So I showed him the little transistor he was soldering there and this, and then I made him think about the fact that shrank down to this, and all of this shrank down to that little chip. It really kind of excited him and showed him what kind of changes have gone on in technology. I opened my for injury by pointing out that this is all change that has happened within my lifetime. So the old jokes began again. He loves doing those. Uh, so this was started off as, to me, as I wanted to use as much of it as I could. In the end, I've got the knobs, I've got the outside plate, and I made my initial determinations that I wasn't going to do anything that required cutting into this or altering the body in any way. This was going to be the most pristine part of the whole thing, which meant that for input into this system, I really only had the two knobs that I could be working with, and we'll talk in a later episode about the input and output as far as for the display and for the controls, because I had multiple, even though I had multiple choices of using either rotary encoders or potentiometers, I still only had that one form factor, if you will, of a rotary dial of some kind to handle for the inputs. And also, while I have this nice little gorgeous plate that has these 7 stations to tell you what frequency, I wasn't sure how much I wanted to keep this, which left me then with some various choices to come up with as far as how I was going to display what channel you were on and what the was. My original plan had been to take this plate, this back plate, and copy it into a graphics program and then laser cut my own plate with some of my own logos and my own designs on it. But well, I was having some challenges with that, but I wasn't afraid of the challenges. But I kept thinking about the fact that I wanted to keep as much of this as intact as I could, and I wasn't going to be keeping any of the internals. So I ended up deciding to keep the original back plate as well. So now that I've got my initial structure, I had to start thinking about what was I going to use for its internals? Was I going to use something like an Arduino? Was I going to use a Raspberry Pi? Was I going to cannibalize a more modern transistor radio and use its mechanisms in here? But because I wanted to go with an internet radio, I wanted to be able to pull music in from specifically Soma FM and one other radio station out of Milwaukee, the Current. For my wife and I, we listen to, between the Current and Soma FM, those are pretty much the main things that you will find being streamed in a given moment inside our house. So I had a finite list of channels I wanted to do, and I wanted to pull the internet. So I had to choose between a Raspberry Pi, an Arduino, possibly some other equivalent. And there were so many things I didn't know were options at the time. And I didn't know at that point how to use an Arduino for streaming internet radio. So this original project began with my frame and going down the path of using a Raspberry Pi. To show you just how old this project is when I began this project, I think the most modern Pi in existence was the Pi B. I don't even believe the B Plus. If the B Plus existed, I didn't have one. So this started with a B. It has since gone. The current model is a Model 2 Raspberry Pi. But for me, the biggest thing that has been a challenge for this project is learning a lot about my own way of handling some of these frustrations. Every time I would hit a blocking point, and believe me, there have been plenty of them, but every time I hit a frustration point, I'd bash into it over and over again. I'd spend a couple of days just banging into it, trying to figure it out. And then I would say, well, clearly this solution isn't going to work. And I would go and research some completely different solution, abandoning the first one that I had started with. So instead of figuring out option 1, I explored option 2, which meant that I had to learn an entirely new idea. And then when that got in my way, I never finished learning one thing. Every time I got to a breaking point on it, I just moved to the next thing, which meant that I never learned any one thing to its entirety, and it meant that I just kept pushing this project further and further out. Now, if I haven't said it already, I do want to say this is still not yet a finished project. So you will see the various pieces that I've abandoned and where we're going from there. I also want to take this time, as I promised I was going to be doing in each and given episode. I want to show you up here there are some upcoming maker fairs around the world. So if any of these maker fairs that you see on the screen are in your area, please do yourself a favor and stop by. The greatest show and tell on earth. A maker fair, as I mentioned, a makerspace is like having a gym access, but for makers. A maker fair is Comic-Con for makers in some ways. It's an opportunity for makers to come together, show what they've been building, and it's all across the spectrum. My particular area is obviously electronics, but there are people doing sewing craft, there's large-scale construction, there is food is a form of makers that are out there, and it's amazing to see the diversity of projects and what you can learn. And if there's something that interests you, please, by all means, stop and say hi and ask how they did it. Almost every maker you're ever going to meet will not hesitate to tell you what's going on and how they did their project. So if you have any particular questions or concerns about this project, please go ahead and contact us at feedback@verbosemode.tv. And until next time, try again, fail better.